My name is Jenna Myers. I am 31 years old, and I'm a biracial woman working in tech, the kind of industry where being underestimated comes with the dress code. For the last 12 months, I had devoted my entire life to one project, one vision, one idea that had been growing in my brain like a second heartbeat. I was the lead strategist on a product innovation pipeline for our company's aging data platform, something no one had wanted to touch for years because it was too messy, too outdated, too riddled with past failures to be salvaged. But I saw potential in it, like how someone might walk past a crumbling brownstone and imagine a dream home beneath the dust and decay. I spent late nights in the office lit only by the glow of dual monitors, ran analytics while eating instant ramen at my desk, and carried wireframes in my dreams. Weekends blurred into weekdays, holidays became workdays, and every sacrifice felt worth it because I was building something that could outlive me. I believed in it more than I believed in most things, including the people I worked under. My supervisor, Natalie Price, had always had a taste for control disguised as mentorship. She liked to hover and correct, but she rarely created anything of her own. She was the kind of woman who printed out PowerPoints in color and highlighted her own name. Still, I played along. I gave her updates, shared wins, even credited her during presentations to keep the peace. And then, on a gray Tuesday that started like any other, I watched a year of my life disappear in a single breath. I was coming back from a client sync when I noticed the shared drive was empty. Not just one folder, but all of them. Every draft, every note, every visual roadmap I had constructed. Gone. At first, I thought it was a glitch. I refreshed the drive, signed out and back in, even ran a permissions audit. Then I checked the admin logs and saw her name, Natalie. She had wiped everything clean at 2:14 p.m. I confronted her immediately, heart pounding like a war drum, and she didn't even look surprised. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair, crossed her arms slowly, and said with that familiar manufactured smile, "Start over." "It's not usable." I stood there, stunned, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright, like a spotlight shining on the wreckage of a car crash no one else noticed. I remember thinking that the air in the room had shifted, like it had tilted slightly to the left, just enough to let gravity betray me. That was the moment something in me snapped quietly, not with rage, but with resolve. She didn't just delete files. She deleted a year of my passion, my weekends, my sleep. But what she really erased was the last piece of me that still wanted to play nice. Her name was Natalie Price, and if you only ever saw her at town halls or quarterly review meetings, you'd think she was the second coming of Sheryl Sandberg. She spoke in polished phrases, walked into rooms like they owed her applause, and laughed a little too loudly at her own PowerPoint jokes. She had a talent for weaving words into webs, for making mediocrity sound like strategy, and for absorbing the spotlight like a solar panel, storing the energy while everyone else dimmed. But behind closed doors, her voice sharpened like a scalpel, and her eyes turned calculating. There were no jokes then, no gentle coaching, just sudden feedback that felt more like a trap than a nudge. She weaponized silence in one-on-ones and knew exactly when to tilt her head and say something that sounded like concern but stung like warning. Everyone around her learned to stay small, to avoid eye contact, to reply to her emails within 5 minutes, even on weekends, to never enter her office without a notebook and a self-preservation instinct. They called it being efficient, but I knew it was fear, and I was foolish enough not to feel it. I walked in with confidence and curiosity, with sleeves rolled up and questions that poked at the corners of her authority. I asked why we did things a certain way and offered other solutions when hers didn't hold up. Not loudly, not rudely, just with the kind of logic that made her blink and tighten her lips. At first she smiled through it, called me ambitious, said I reminded her of herself. But her compliments had serrated edges, and eventually they turned into corrections, then criticisms, then cold dismissal. She started scheduling meetings without me, deleting comments I made on shared documents, and looping others into projects I had spearheaded. When I asked about it, she waved a hand like I was being dramatic, said I should focus on my core tasks and let leadership handle the broader vision. I was demoted without ever being told I had fallen. My teammates noticed, of course, but no one said anything. They had seen others cross Natalie and disappear quietly, like footprints swallowed by a tide. I stayed, still hoping I could work harder, do better, prove myself through results. But it was never about results. It was about control. Natalie couldn't tolerate anything she didn't author or orchestrate. She wanted minions, not thinkers. Mirrors, not minds. And I had walked in like a mirror with its own ideas of what should be reflected. That was my mistake. Not challenging her, believing she would value strength in someone she hadn't personally selected or molded. I thought being right would protect me. I thought results would matter. But in Natalie's world, power wasn't earned. It was hoarded. And anyone who forgot that didn't last long. It started slowly, like a leak behind a wall, barely noticeable until everything was soaked. Natalie began responding to my emails with delays so long they looped into irrelevance, then acting surprised when deadlines were missed or details misaligned. "Did you send that to me?" She'd ask with a raised brow and an innocent tone that made me doubt my own memory, even though I knew the answer was yes. I started double-checking, triple-checking, blind copying myself, then printing things like it was 2003 just to be sure I wasn't losing my mind. Then came the meetings I was no longer invited to, the ones where decisions were made about projects I had led and suddenly wasn't part of anymore. I'd hear about them in passing, hallway mentions and Slack messages that said things like, "Natalie said she'd fill you in," when she never did. I brought it up once, gently, in a check-in. She smiled, sipped her latte like we were just two colleagues chatting about workflow, and said, "You've been stretched so thin lately. I figured I'd give you some breathing room." But what she gave me was silence, and what she took was space. Space to speak, space to lead, space to own what I had built. In meetings where I was still present, she started questioning my ideas, with an edge she didn't use on anyone else. "Are we sure that's scalable? That seems a little off-brand for us." Let's circle back to that. Words that sounded like feedback but felt like digs. My suggestions were parked in the corner, my plans rewritten with no explanation, and whenever I spoke, she tilted her head like she was listening but didn't trust me to finish a sentence without supervision. The final straw came when she presented my research to the executive team without my name on it. I sat there watching my own words on her slides, a ghost haunting the presentation I had built. Afterward, she gave me a thumbs up and said, "We nailed it." That was the day I went to HR. I didn't storm in with fire. I walked in like I was carrying glass, careful and precise. I explained the pattern, the inconsistencies, the disappearing opportunities. I showed them calendar invites, email trails, document version histories. The HR rep nodded a lot, said things like, "That's definitely concerning," and "We take these situations seriously." Then she leaned forward, lowered her voice slightly, and said, "Document everything. Keep a record. Don't stop doing good work." I walked out with a polite smile and a knot in my stomach, knowing full well what that meant. They wouldn't intervene. Not yet. Maybe not ever. They were giving me permission to collect my own receipts, to become my own body cam, because no one was going to protect me from Natalie Price but me. So I did exactly what they said. I documented everything. And every entry was a match waiting to be lit. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The kind where the office feels a little too quiet and the light outside the windows looks like it's thinking about rain. Natalie had called me into a meeting that wasn't on my calendar, told me in her crisp, passive-aggressive tone that she was concerned about my recent attitude and whether I truly understood the collaborative nature of our team. I said what I always say in situations like that, calm and clear, reminding her that collaboration should not mean erasure, and that no one else was contributing at the level I was. She narrowed her eyes and leaned back like she was deciding whether I was a threat or just exhausting. We went back and forth, nothing loud, nothing dramatic, but enough tension that when I walked out of her office, I felt like I'd just survived a small storm. I returned to my desk needing to ground myself, needing to dive back into the thing I had been building for nearly a year. The strategic framework I had developed piece by piece, late night by late night, my fingerprints on every single file. But when I opened the shared folder, it was empty, completely blank. I stared at the screen, blinking hard, refreshing like maybe the files were hiding, like maybe my laptop was just being slow or glitchy. I checked the admin panel, checked the version history, checked every possible explanation, except the one that kept rising, like bile in the back of my throat. Someone had manually deleted everything. The folder, the subfolders, the notes, the backup copies, nested in side paths. Gone. Every roadmap, every deck, every user journey flow I had crafted with meticulous care, all erased like they had never existed. I sat frozen, then stood and walked right back to her office. She was typing something when I entered, not even looking up until I said her name. "Natalie, the shared drive is empty. Everything's been deleted." She gave a theatrical frown and said, "Oh no, are you sure? You didn't move the files accidentally?" I didn't blink. I checked the admin log. Someone with manager-level access removed them all. She tilted her head and said, "Well, maybe you forgot to back them up properly." These things happen. I wanted to scream, but instead I nodded like I believed her, like I hadn't just watched my entire year vanish with a few keystrokes. I knew better. I knew exactly what she had done. And I knew it wasn't clumsiness or coincidence. It was punishment. Punishment for not being obedient enough, for not staying small, for making her feel outshined in a world she thought she owned. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have guessed, was that I had backups. Not on the drive, not in the cloud she controlled, but on a private archive she never even thought to look for. She thought she had burned it all down, but all she had done was strike the match. The meeting was supposed to be a routine sync, the kind where everyone brings their coffee and pretends to care while secretly answering Slack messages under the table, but Natalie had other plans. She stood at the front of the room with her clicker in hand like she was preparing to deliver a keynote, her slide deck already pulled up behind her, filled with ideas and branding that looked suspiciously familiar. I sat in the second row, my palms flat against the cool surface of the conference table, heart ticking louder with every word that came out of her mouth. She opened with a performance, thanking the team for their patience while we reassessed direction, as if she hadn't personally deleted 12 months of my work 3 days earlier. I knew she was about to twist the knife. I could feel it in the way she kept glancing in my direction with that smile she wore, like lip gloss, shiny but fake. Then she clicked to a blank slide, turned toward the group, and said, "The original concept is no longer aligned with our goals. We'll be starting over." Someone across the room made a confused noise, but she cut them off before they could speak. "It's not usable anyway," she added with a shrug, like she was commenting on the weather, not erasing a year of my career in real time. And then she smirked. That smug little upturn of her lips that made it clear this wasn't a pivot, it was a public execution. One of her favorites in sales laughed, a sharp bark of amusement that set off a few uncomfortable chuckles around the table. No one looked at me directly. No one asked me to speak. The air turned thick and slow, like moving through syrup, and I just sat there, my face calm, my throat burning. I thought about standing up, about telling the room what she had done, but the words dried up in my mouth, because the truth was, they already knew, or at least they suspected, and none of them were willing to take the risk of confirming it. So I nodded. I sat there and nodded like I agreed, like I accepted her assessment, like I was just another junior strategist whose ideas had not quite landed. And in that moment, I stopped trying to fix anything. I stopped hoping she would change or the system would protect me or the truth would win. I started planning instead. Not revenge, not yet, but escape. Quiet, calculated, thorough. I would not yell. I would not cry. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Let her think she won. Let her believe I was broken. Because while she was busy pretending I was finished, I was already building my exit in silence. And when I walked out, I would not just leave. I would rise, and she would watch every second of it. The thing about people like Natalie is that they think they are the smartest person in every room, which makes them reckless. She assumed that deleting my work meant erasing it completely, but what she never considered was that I had stopped trusting her months ago, long before she made it official. I had seen the warning signs, the sudden gaps in meeting invites, the changed permissions on files I created, the moments when she smiled a little too widely while canceling my presentations at the last minute. So I started saving everything, quietly, obsessively, every strategy doc, every pitch slide, every note scribbled in the margins of internal brainstorming sessions. I copied them from the shared drive and stored them on a private cloud under a personal alias. I even had local backups on an external hard drive, the kind I kept in the bottom drawer of my apartment desk beneath old tax forms and expired travel adapters. At the time, it felt paranoid, dramatic even, like preparing for a fire no one else could smell, but now it felt like prophecy. After the meeting, where she publicly discarded everything I had built, I returned to my desk, opened my private vault, and there it all was. Every color-coded roadmap, every market segmentation report, every diagram I had drawn on whiteboards at 10 p.m. and photographed so I could digitize them later. None of it gone, none of it lost. I stared at the screen for a long time, not smiling, not triumphant, just still. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff you were pushed off of, only to realize halfway down that you had a parachute after all. I didn't tell anyone, not HR, not my teammates, not even my closest friend in the department. It was mine, my insurance policy, my proof. I let Natalie parade around the office like a conqueror, confidently rewriting history, holding meetings about our fresh direction with my framework still echoing beneath her stolen buzzwords. She thought I had nothing. She thought I had given up. I answered her emails politely. I showed up to every meeting. I even took notes in the margins of her half-baked plans, pretending they were brilliant. But behind the scenes, I was organizing my files, creating clean summaries, perfecting the version of the story I would tell when the time was right. I had no intention of getting even. Not yet. I had something better. I had the truth. And truth, when you hold it long enough and aim it just right, can be sharper than revenge. So I waited. I watched her strut down hallways in her pointed heels and sharp blazers, completely unaware that the very thing she tried to destroy was alive and well and sitting quietly in the shadows, waiting for its moment to step into the light. It started with a casual coffee, the kind you set up under the vague pretense of catching up, but where every word carries weight. I reached out to Kara, an old colleague turned friend, who now worked as a director at a competitor's firm. We met at a quiet cafe on a side street near Union Station, the kind with mismatched chairs and too many kinds of tea, and I told her I had been working on something big, something ambitious, something that could change how our sector handled user integration and data flow. I didn't give her documents or details, just pieces. Enough to spark curiosity, not enough to tip my hand. Her eyes lit up halfway through my explanation, the way they used to when we'd brainstorm in whiteboard rooms before Natalie had turned every idea into a landmine. "Jenna," she said, "that sounds exactly like what we're trying to solve for." I smiled into my cup and told her I was just spitballing, just dreaming out loud, but I left that meeting with her card, a promise to stay in touch, and something I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. Leverage. From there, I expanded the circle. I met with a recruiter I had known since grad school, sent a polite check-in to my old mentor, who now sat at the executive level of a firm known for poaching talent quietly. Each time I told a slightly fuller version of the story, not the part about Natalie or the deletion or the gaslighting, but the part about the product, the systems, the innovation I had spent a year building. They listened. They asked smart questions. And when I answered, I watched the shift happen, the way interest folds into recognition and then into intent. It was like placing a match near dry kindling, waiting for the right gust of wind. I kept it professional. I was careful. No promises, no attachments, just conversations layered with subtext. The kind where people say things like, "If you're ever thinking of making a move," and "We're always looking for someone with your kind of vision." It wasn't just about leaving. It was about knowing I had options, that the world outside Natalie's control still existed and was wide enough to catch me. It was also about reclaiming a part of myself she had worked so hard to shrink. The strategist, the builder, the woman who once walked into rooms and made them listen. I didn't need validation from her. I needed opportunity. I needed space to breathe again. And I could feel it now, rising quietly under the surface of every email, every nod across a cafe table, every LinkedIn message that began with, "Loved your recent work." The Whisper Network had heard me, and they were starting to speak back. All I had to do now was choose the moment, The moment I would stop whispering and start walking. The meeting was held in a sleek downtown office that smelled faintly of bergamot and ambition, all clean lines and hushed voices behind glass walls. I was ushered in by an assistant with perfect posture and a tablet in her hand. And as I sat down across from two of the top executives at Vireo Systems, our biggest competitor, I reminded myself to stay calm, to stay sharp, to remember that I was no longer here to prove myself, but to present myself. They had reached out first, a carefully worded email from someone in talent acquisition who said they had been hearing good things about me from trusted voices, and would I be open to a conversation? I kept it vague at first, cautious, but something in their tone suggested they already knew more than they were letting on, and they did. Before I had even opened my laptop, one of them, a woman named Laurel with kind eyes and a razor wit, leaned forward and said, "We've heard what happened." Not the full story, of course, but enough to know someone made a very big mistake. I didn't flinch. I just smiled, opened my device, and began to walk them through the work Natalie had tried to erase. I didn't come in with bitterness or revenge, only clarity. I showed them the structure of the system I had built, the integrated flow of user data, the predictive modeling, the visual design layers that made it feel intuitive rather than overwhelming. I spoke like someone who had nothing to hide and nothing left to lose, and I watched as their expressions shifted from polite interest to open astonishment. Questions came fast after that, real ones, the kind that only get asked when someone sees potential they want to claim before anyone else does. When I finished, there was a silence that felt like standing at the top of a mountain, breathless, and waiting for the next step. Laurel finally said, "This is exactly what we've been trying to build, only better." 2 days later, I received the formal offer, triple my current salary, full creative control over the direction of the product, a dedicated team reporting directly to me, remote flexibility, equity, a signing bonus that made me blink. I stared at the offer letter alone in my apartment, the city lights spilling through the blinds like spilled glitter, and felt something inside me start to unfold. Not just relief, not just validation, but reclamation. The version of me Natalie had tried to bury was suddenly standing taller, brighter, undeniable. I didn't need to think about it. I signed. I accepted. And when I did, it wasn't just a new chapter. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like I belonged to myself again. I had taken what she tried to destroy and turned it into my own liberation, and she had no idea what was coming. I printed the resignation letter on thick paper, the kind that makes a soft whisper when you slide it onto a desk, the kind that says, "I thought about this, I prepared, I am not running, I am choosing." I didn't dress up or dramatize the moment. I wore my usual black slacks and a blouse with sleeves rolled up, the same way I had always shown up, ready to do the work, ready to be underestimated. Natalie's office door was ajar, her posture curled forward over her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard like she was composing something brilliant. She didn't glance up when I knocked softly and stepped in. I placed the letter in front of her, centered and aligned, and said simply, "This is my formal notice. Effective 2 weeks from today." She kept typing for a beat too long, as if to finish her sentence and remind me where the power Saturday. Then she leaned back slightly, eyes still on the screen, and said, "Good luck," in the tone people use when they mean goodbye forever and not in the kind way. I said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, but because she didn't deserve to hear what was coming from my mouth. Let her hear it from someone else. Let her find out the same way she found out about the company's softball roster or new policies, late and with no say in it. I turned and left without asking for a reference, without recapping accomplishments, without offering to smooth the transition. I owed her nothing. And I knew that in time, the silence I left behind would echo louder than any speech. In the days that followed, I tied up loose ends, not for her but for the people who had always treated me with quiet respect. I left instructions, documentation, passwords. I said my goodbyes in elevators and side hallways, in brief glances and coded smiles. Some people knew more than they let on. One engineer from product whispered, "You deserved better," as we crossed paths in the break room. Another slipped a note onto my desk that said, "You inspired more people than you think." I didn't cry. I didn't get sentimental. But I did walk through that building like someone who had survived it, not someone who had been broken by it. On my final day, I left a copy of the strategy brief I had once built tucked inside the folder she used for her daily reports. Just a title page, no name, no explanations. Just enough to remind her that brilliance had passed through her office and she hadn't even noticed. She didn't look up when I walked out for the last time. She didn't know that the company's fiercest competitor had just hired the one person who had solved the problem she still pretended to understand. She didn't know the goodbye wasn't the end. It was the warning shot. And the silence that followed would not be peace. It would be the sound of everything shifting. We called it solace, a name that felt both clean and pointed, a word that held quiet rebellion inside it, because what is solace if not the healing that follows harm? It was my first major initiative at Vireo, and it was built from the very bones of the vision Natalie had tried to pretend was never worth anything. But now it was sleeker, sharper, and polished by collaboration instead of control. I had a team of engineers who listened, not because they feared me, but because they believed in what we were building. The UI was redesigned to feel like air. The back-end architecture rebuilt with scale in mind, and every integration we used was pulled from the notes I had once begged for budget approval to explore. Only now, no one was questioning whether it was worth it. They handed me the resources and stepped back, trusting me to lead. I had never felt power like that before, not the kind that came from titles or corner offices, but the kind that came from people believing in your mind and giving you room to run. It launched 6 weeks ahead of schedule. No drama, no hand-holding, no last-minute sabotage hidden behind smiling feedback, just excellence delivered. The press release dropped on a Tuesday morning, coordinated across media channels with strategic previews sent to key journalists. The headline read, "Vireo Systems unveils Solace, a groundbreaking data integration platform built for the future." Underneath was my name, Jenna Myers, listed as lead architect and project director, with a quote that said, "When we give innovators the freedom to lead, the result speaks for itself." And it did. Within hours, industry blogs were dissecting it, LinkedIn was flooded with reposts, and clients from my old job were liking the announcement and leaving comments that made my phone buzz with satisfaction. I could picture Natalie reading it, fingers tight around her mug, mouth pulled into that thin line she wore when someone else got credit. But this time, there was no one left to mute the noise. I had not only built the thing she tried to kill, I had built it bigger, better, and with people who knew how to get out of the way when talent walked into the room. At noon, our internal Slack thread was filled with screenshots, champagne emojis, and digital confetti. My team surprised me with cupcakes in the break room, and Laurel, the executive who had first believed in me, raised her glass and said, "To solace." And to second chances that don't feel like second best. I smiled, not because I had won, but because I had survived the fire and turned its ashes into blueprints. Natalie had tried to erase me, but in the end, all she did was force me to write the story louder, clearer, and with a signature at the bottom no one could ignore. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it in fragments, passed through the same whisper network that had once helped me find my way out. The day the Solace press release dropped, Natalie's office door stayed closed longer than usual. The blinds snapped shut like a defense mechanism, and the energy on her floor was described as brittle, like the tension you feel right before glass shatters. Her team, the ones who had once chuckled politely when she dismissed my work, were stunned. They had no idea something like Solace was coming, much less that it had launched so flawlessly, so comprehensively, with a vision that looked hauntingly familiar. People started whispering questions behind her back, the kind of questions that leave bruises. Didn't we have something like that in development last year? Wasn't that Jenna's old project? How did they move that fast without insider access? But I hadn't taken anything illegally. I had built it from the version I had created long before Natalie clicked delete. My ideas, my frameworks, my direction, all refined and reimagined with a team that actually cared. But the similarities were too sharp to ignore, and Natalie had spent too much time convincing people that my original strategy was unusable. Now she was faced with the undeniable reality that not only had it been usable, it had been brilliant, and she had thrown it away like scrap paper. The board was furious. not just because we beat them to launch, but because the market responded instantly. Clients they had been courting started asking pointed questions, wondering why their competitors were already piloting a solution that had supposedly been years away. Internal emails circulated, meetings were called. Analysts pulled timelines, trying to piece together how we had pulled it off so quickly. Someone flagged archived project files and noticed the eerie alignment between what I had once pitched and what now bore my name on a rival banner. Natalie was asked to explain, to account for the gap, the pivot, the loss, and she scrambled. She said we had shifted strategy, that the original model wasn't scalable, that Jenna had gone in a different direction creatively. But the problem with lying in a place that worships data is that someone always runs the numbers. And the numbers didn't lie. The structure was too familiar, the vision too aligned. The questions got louder, and the confidence in her leadership began to splinter. She tried to spin it as coincidence, to downplay the overlap, but her team had seen the original roadmaps. They had watched her dismantle something they now realized could have been their win, and slowly, the loyalty she had depended on began to erode, one sideways glance and quiet conversation at a time. I didn't gloat. I didn't post anything inflammatory or smug. I let the facts do the work. I let the silence she left behind speak louder than any accusation. Because Natalie was finally learning what I had known all along. You can only delete something if no one remembers it. And unfortunately for her, everyone remembered. It started quietly, like most reckonings do, with a flagged concern during a board review and a request for an internal audit that no one publicly acknowledged but everyone felt humming beneath the surface. At first, Natalie acted like it was just routine, brushing it off with a smile and saying things like, "They're just being thorough," while privately scrambling to clean up the mess she had once convinced herself would never catch up to her. But audits, especially the kind conducted by compliance teams with no personal loyalties, are rarely kind to those who depend on control through manipulation. HR began pulling system logs, starting with the dates surrounding my resignation and the days following the Solace launch. They combed through shared drive permissions, deleted files, and recovered versions she thought had vanished. They found records of me being removed from meeting invites, time-stamped edits on my original strategy documents, even internal Slack threads where she had cast doubt on my work and suggested I was struggling to keep up, a narrative she had pushed while simultaneously gutting my access. My documentation surfaced next, that neat folder I had submitted to HR months ago with email chains, version histories, and meeting recaps she had tried to bury beneath silence. It was all there, cold and chronological, impossible to spin. The people who had once nodded along to her leadership now saw the cracks, the pattern, the way she lifted ideas just high enough to claim them before cutting off the people who built them. One by one, others began to speak up, emboldened by the paper trail. A junior designer shared how she had been removed from a project after disagreeing with Natalie in a team huddle. An analyst admitted he was told to change data points to fit a narrative before a quarterly report. A former marketing associate came forward with screenshots of credit being reassigned mid-campaign. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all the people who had been bent or broken in her orbit. The house of cards Natalie had constructed so carefully, balancing her ambition on other people's silence, began to collapse with every pulled log and corroborated complaint. The board stopped smiling when she walked into the room. HR began requesting meetings without sending agendas. People who once rushed to defend her suddenly went quiet or conveniently remembered what they had ignored. She was still trying to hold it together, still wearing her sharp heels and designer blouses, still performing competence, but her confidence had curdled. The woman who once spoke like her word was law now stammered when asked simple questions. The irony of it all was that the thing she tried to destroy, the story she tried to erase, had come back stronger, not in anger, but in evidence. And Natalie, for all her rehearsed charm and polished lies, had nothing left to hide behind except her own reflection. It happened on a Monday, fitting somehow, the kind of day that already felt heavy with stale coffee and half-hearted optimism. There was no big announcement, no all-staff email wrapped in euphemisms about new opportunities or spending more time with family, just a quiet removal of access, a deactivated badge, and a line in the internal directory that simply read inactive. People noticed immediately. Natalie's name disappeared from the org chart, like a stain someone had finally gotten tired of scrubbing around. Her office was suddenly locked. Her assistant, normally glued to her side like a shadow that knew better than to speak, was seen boxing up personal items and avoiding eye contact. The news spread fast, not because anyone said it directly, but because every hallway conversation changed tone. Every inbox buzzed with the same shared electricity, the kind that ripples through a system when power shifts. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing mock-ups for the next Solace update, when my phone lit up with the first message. It was from a former teammate, someone who had once glanced at Natalie before answering any question. "She's gone," it said. No punctuation, no need. I just stared at it for a second, the words sharp and clean like truth finally surfacing. Then came more. Emails, DMs, Slack pings. Some congratulated me outright. Others were more careful, just thumbs up or party emojis. But the subtext was the same. One message stood out more than the rest. It came from a junior dev who had left quietly months before me, one of the many who had slipped through the cracks and never said why. She wrote, "You did what we all wished we could. You didn't just leave. You exposed her." I read that line twice, then closed my laptop and sat back, letting it settle over me like a warm weight. I had never set out to become anyone's symbol, never imagined myself as a cautionary tale-turned-quiet hero. I just wanted my work to matter. I just wanted my name back. But somehow, in doing that, I had cracked open something bigger. Natalie, for all her polished management speak and curated dominance, had been toppled not by an outburst or a scandal, but by her own pattern, traced and proven, and finally held to the light. No exit speech, no legacy, just a gap where she used to stand and the quiet echo of everyone she had silenced reclaiming their voices. I didn't celebrate publicly. I didn't post cryptic messages or share victory quotes. I just went for a walk that evening, the kind where the sky looks like it's holding its breath before sunset, and I let myself smile, not because she was gone, but because I was still here, standing, building, thriving, and the version of me she tried to erase was now the reason she no longer had a place to stand. The ballroom was colder than it needed to be, the kind of overly air-conditioned space meant to keep nerves sharp and sweat at bay, but I barely noticed. I stood behind the curtain listening to the muffled thrum of the crowd, the rustling of programs, the occasional cough or clink of a water glass. Somewhere out there, rows of faces were waiting, many of them the same ones who had once skimmed past my name in a portfolio, nodded politely through my ideas, or given Natalie the credit for things they knew I had built. Now they were here to hear from me. The keynote badge on my lanyard felt heavier than it looked. The introduction was brief, just a few lines about Solace and my role at Vireo. Then I walked out into the spotlight, heels clicking against the stage floor like punctuation, each step steady and slow. The applause was warm, genuine, not thunderous, but solid, and I could see heads turn, people leaning in. I began the way I always do, not with slides or buzzwords, but with a story. I told them about the early days, about building in silence, about creating something not because it was trendy, but because it was necessary. I talked about failure, about being told no, about hearing that what I had built wasn't usable, and I watched the room shift, eyes softened, arms uncrossed. Some faces, the ones I remembered from the sidelines, looked almost ashamed. Then the questions came, first from the moderator, then from the panel. One woman asked about scaling under pressure. A man near the front wanted to know how I had managed to bring Solace to market so fast without losing clarity. Then came the final question, from a panelist I hadn't met before, a quiet type who had barely spoken until then. He leaned into the microphone and asked, "Where do your best ideas come from?" I smiled, not with bitterness, but with precision, and I said, "Sometimes the best ideas are the ones someone tried to bury." A pause followed, just long enough to let it settle. And then came the applause again, louder this time, layered with something else, respect. I walked off stage with my shoulders light and my breath easy. The hallway outside the ballroom filled quickly. People approached me with handshakes and questions, not small talk, not networking, but real questions. the kind I had waited my whole career to be asked. Someone from a firm I used to dream of working for handed me a card. Another asked if I would consider mentoring. I smiled and said I would think about it. Not out of ego, but out of the quiet realization that I had earned the space to choose. The girl Natalie had tried to diminish was now the woman standing at the center of the conversation. And no one could unsee her anymore. I never say her name on stage, in interviews, or in the articles they now ask me to write. When people talk about my journey, about solace, about the shift I brought into the industry, I let them tell the story however they want, but I never offer the villain. I don't need to. Natalie faded in the way people do when their power was only ever built on proximity and fear, not real skill or integrity. I flourished because I had to rebuild myself from the ashes she left behind, and when you do that, you learn to carry fire in your bones. People sometimes ask about the challenges I faced, and I speak in metaphors, about resistance, about buried work, about the cost of being underestimated, but I never say it was her. I don't need revenge in the way I once thought I might. I don't want her reputation ruined or her name dragged through digital dirt. I want exactly what I have now. I want to walk into rooms and see people listening. I want to look in the mirror and recognize myself again. I want to build without fear that someone will tear it down out of spite or ego or insecurity disguised as leadership. And I have that now. That is my victory. She thought deleting my work would erase my worth. She thought silencing me would stop the echo. But what happened instead was simple. I got louder in a language she never understood. I let the work speak. I let it ripple and grow and land in places she will never be invited to. And slowly, without confrontation, without dramatic takedowns, she disappeared. People forgot her. They rewrote the projects she used to own. Her name stopped being whispered in admiration and started becoming a cautionary tale spoken in quiet HR meetings and behind closed doors. Meanwhile, I kept building. I started mentoring other women who were told they were too outspoken, too ambitious, too much. I helped shape policies that protected employees from the kind of quiet cruelty I once endured. I poured everything she had tried to diminish into something real, something that changed more than just my life. And when I walk into my office now, sunlight spilling across the polished wood table where I lead strategy sessions, I don't think of her. I think of how far I came and how much further I still plan to go. The best revenge was never about proving her wrong. It was proving myself right, and I did, without shouting, without dragging her through the mud. Just by surviving her, then surpassing her, then outgrowing the version of me that ever needed her approval in the first place. She tried to end my story. What she really did was start the part I am proudest of.